There is something genuinely sacred about the 4 years that students who go to residential colleges undergo. For most people, this is really their only time to ponder life's great challenges and to be reflective in a very serious way about what kind of adult life they want to lead. I'm Eric Adler, and I'm a professor of classics at the University of Maryland. It's my contention, but not only my contention, certainly that the humanities are not faring particularly well on contemporary college campuses. A lot of the defenses that have come out recently, although well-intentioned, are not really offering the best argument that we can. Most of the arguments highlight the skills that the humanities offer students. The skill most often vouched for is something nebulously called critical thinking, which I don't think is actually a particularly good defense of the humanities. The humanistic tradition began in some senses with Cicero. He is the formative theorist of the humanistic tradition, at least as it comes down to us from antiquity. He was a statesman and orator and philosopher in the 1st century BC who was really concerned about the future of the Roman Republic. So he comes up with this very Greek-inspired conception of elite Roman education that is going to focus on all sorts of non-vocational subjects, so kind of liberal arts subjects, liberal in the sense of free, that are attuned to higher ideals that can instill this quality of humanitas or humaneness in those who are receiving this sort of education, with the hopes that such people would be more interested in acting in a selfless manner to try to save the state in a time of peril. Colleges in the United States, from the colonial period moving all the way forward to the Civil War, are dominated by the study of Latin and Greek, and they tended to have completely prescribed curricula. There were no majors, there were no choices. You would take all the same stuff, study all the same authors. The founding fathers' imaginations were deeply influenced by their own studies of classical literature. So it was rather natural for them, when building the government of the United States, to think back on Greek and Roman precedents for what sort of a government they wanted the United States to possess. There were kind of always criticisms from some Americans about the character of these colleges. America obviously is a very pragmatic society, and they had a country that needed to be tamed, land needed to be tamed, and there were a number of people who thought that it was sort of peculiar and maybe even unbecomingly European to have a kind of elite Latin and Greek inspired education that was only for, a select group of learned professions. This comes to be more controversial as you get into the 19th century, and America begins to industrialize, especially with the presidency of Andrew Jackson, becomes more populist, and is less in the hands of, the John Adams type, the aristocratic yeoman, classically educated farmer. Going along with that is all these scientific advances, the kind of burgeoning of the social sciences, and a number of people thinking, why should the sciences play such a small role in the education of Americans given their potentially vocational importance as well? And that all leads up to the Battle of the Classics, which begins in the 1880s and it goes into the 19-teens. And that's the sort of big brawl between the traditionalists, who state that there are particular texts that everyone needs to read in order to be an educated person, and modernists who want to have an elective curriculum. And that's sort of part of the Battle of the Classics too. What sort of institutions do we want to have in America, and what sort of education ought they be providing? There were a number of arguments that were made from those who were supportive of the continuation of classics dominating the college curriculum. And a number of people saw that this was going to be a tough fight, and that in some ways there was something countercultural about trying to maintain a vision of education increasingly out of step with a more democratic and industrializing country. The argument that dominated the traditionalistic defenses of the classics in that era was mental discipline. The idea that Latin and Greek needed to stay central parts of the college curriculum because they were harder. They were just tougher on your brain, and therefore they were the most fitting ways to get you to be a smarter person. One of the problems is they didn't really have any proof that that was true, that studying Latin and Greek was harder than German or chemistry. The second problem is their opponents are largely social scientists, and social scientists can test empirically which subjects end up having the best effect on your brain. So instead, they ceded the ground of education's value to their opponents, and they lost. Mental discipline was the kind of 19th century corollary to critical thinking. And so I think the kind of skills talk that we're doing today, although sometimes necessary, is the same sort of losing argument that lost during the Battle of the Classics. I do think one of the peculiarities of how scientistic our contemporary study has become is that we really undercut the role of the imagination in human flourishing. And that's one thing that I think is really of central importance. And that's something that, say, advertisers recognize very much. So if you watch an advertisement, very seldom do you get a dry relation of the benefits of an individual product. Instead, you get, Matthew McConaughey driving shirtless in a Lincoln or what have you. Now, you have to be a fool to think that if you purchase a Lincoln, I hate if that's your sponsor, that you will be transformed into a shirtless Matthew McConaughey. But obviously that stuff works, or they would not continue to do that. Well, if a silly advertisement for a car can do that, just imagine what the works of imaginative masterminds that have been read for millennia can actually do. And so I think that what you read matters. It is a mistake under the circumstances to allow students to go to college and say, take a humanities class. It doesn't really matter what the text is. No, it matters centrally what it is that you read, because what it is that you read ends up shaping you as a human being. There's something kind of perverse about allowing those who are uneducated to choose what the curriculum ought to be. For millennia, there have been people who have been thinking about these particular texts, and they've been canonical for providing the most profound reflections on the human condition. Again, what you read matters and shouldn't just be whatever floats your boat, or in the case of contemporary colleges, what doesn't meet on Friday, or what doesn't make you wake up at 9 a.m. The sort of humanist regard for being a better person has been cast aside. And instead, it's focused more on a kind of romantic perception that people are by nature good and you just need to live up to your own impulses. And at the same period of time, the sort of scientific investigations that one engages in are going to naturally make the world a better place as we gain more material comforts and greater mastery over nature. There's a concern that this sort of education is going to create something that Irving Babbitt called efficient megalomaniacs. For example, our current generation of Silicon Valley tech giants who all say, it's almost a kind of line now out of a sitcom, that the reason they invented their app or what have you is to make the world a better place. And yet if you see the social science literature on these apps, most of their users are actually deeply depressed and hooked on their phones and so forth. Irving Babbitt believed that the most important struggle in a human life, sort of the central human drama, is the so-called civil war in the cave between one's higher potentialities and one's lower potentialities, that one needed to learn to foment one's good impulses, those that are altruistic, those that are good for oneself, but also good for other people, and also to tamp down those that are destructive, that are selfish and bad. Our higher education has become increasingly specialized, but it's also become increasingly vocational. A lot of that has to do with the democratization of higher education, but also financial tensions, colleges are more expensive and so forth. Yes, it's important to be prepared to go out into the workforce, and it's valuable to study things that give you the kinds of skills that are going to be applicable to one's own career. But life is about more than one's career. Life is also about flourishing and being a full individual. There's a kind of danger about education becoming so vocationally focused and so kind of transactional that students lose sight of higher ideals that really have played a fundamental role in Western education since Greek antiquity. As we're seeing right now, a number of humanities programs are being cut. And they're not being cut at Princeton and Duke and Harvard, the places that very elite people go to. They're being cut at state schools and smaller private schools that are easier to get into. And so we're actually moving back to a kind of earlier tradition then, because very few people went to college and received this sort of education at all. And now very few people may have the opportunity to have that sort of education at all. So it's entirely possible things are actually going to get more unequal, in which only those people who come from an elite are going to have a full humane education. And everybody else is going to be made a mere worker, right? And I don't think that that's good for human flourishing, but it's not good for our society either. There are great dangers in having a kind of education that is not self-reflective and that suggests that we can improve the world without improving ourselves. And that's precisely why we need the humanities.